globally, the narrative around human development is, well, it's almost always exactly the same.
Right. Yeah. It's very predictable.
Exactly. You read the reports, you look at the policy papers, and it is universally this story of women fighting this slow, like uphill grinding battle just to catch up to men.
Yeah. It's always about closing that historical gap.
Right. Closing a gap that's existed for, centuries. But in one specific Caribbean nation, that entire narrative is just completely inverted.
It really is. It's fascinating.
It's wild. Women aren't just catching up. Mathematically, fundamentally, they're like dominating the men in these metrics.
Yeah, they're completely outpacing them.
So today, we are opening up a massive stack of United Nations data. We're looking at 30 years of human development tracking from 1990 all the way to 2023 to figure out how the island nation of Saint Lucia, just completely broke the global mold.
Yeah, and it really forces a total recalibration of how you view societal progress as a whole.
For sure. Welcome to today's Deep Dive, everyone.
Glad to be here. Because, when you look at the global average for gender development, men are still structurally outscoring women.
Right. Everywhere else.
Everywhere else. But in Saint Lucia, the female population is so far ahead in, basic developmental outcomes that the index literally breaks past the barrier of perfect parity.
Which shouldn't even happen, right?
No, it's a statistical phenomenon. It really is.
And that's really the core mission for this deep dive. Because for you, the listener, we are looking at a metric that suggests this, absolute triumph for women.
Right. A total victory on paper.
Yeah, on paper. But numbers can be incredibly deceptive. So we need to figure out if this specific statistic is actually a miracle of modern social policy or, and this is the scary part, if it's masking a much darker, much more complicated structural collapse happening just beneath the surface.
Yeah, and to even begin diagnosing what's happening in St. Lucia, you have to understand the yardstick, right? The actual tool the United Nations uses to measure this stuff.
Right, because we can't really talk about gender parity until we establish the baseline of human development itself.
Exactly. You're talking about the Human Development Index, the HDI.
The HDI, right.
Yes, because for a really long time, the global community just looked at GDP.
Oh, just how much money a country makes.
Right. If a country made a lot of money, we just called it developed.
Which seems a bit reductive.
It's a deeply flawed way to look at human life. Money isn't everything. So the HDI was created to look at three critical dimensions of actual well-being.
Okay, what are the three?
First, are people living long and healthy lives? Second, are they acquiring knowledge through education? And third, do they have a decent standard of living, which is measured by income?
Okay, so it's essentially a nation's vital signs.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it, yeah.
And looking at the 30-year global trend in your notes, the vital signs of the world were, they were actually looking pretty great for a while.
They really were. If you go back to 1990, the global average HDI was hovering right around 0.608. And over the next 3 decades, we witnessed what you could arguably call, a golden era of global progress.
Wow, a golden era.
Yeah, by 2019, that global average had climbed to 0.745.
It's a huge jump.
It is. We saw massive global campaigns against extreme poverty, huge pushes for childhood literacy, and widespread vaccination programs raising life expectancies all over the place.
But looking at the graph here, there's a very clear, very sharp V-shaped gouge in this data timeline right after 2019.
Yeah, the 2020 and 2021 global public health crisis.
Right.
That event didn't just stall human development, it actively threw it in reverse.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, schools closed worldwide, supply chains for basic medical goods collapsed, and we saw a historic drop in global life expectancy. The global HDI fell backward for the first time in decades, down to 0.742.
That's terrifying, actually. But the resilience of the global system is apparent, though, because the data from 2023 shows a recovery, right?
It does, yeah. The world average climbed back up and hit a new all-time high of 0.756.
Okay, so the global tide is rising again. The world, on average, is reaching into that high human development category.
Exactly. Now hold that global V-shaped recovery in your mind, because we need to overlay St. Lucia's specific timeline onto it.
Okay, I'm with you.
Because their trajectory reveals a major hidden tension.
All right, I'm looking at their overall HDI score. Back in 1990, St. Lucia was sitting at 0.683.
Right.
And the global average back then was only 0.608. So they started out with a massive head start.
A very comfortable lead, yeah.
They were crushing the global average. And today, In 2023, their score has grown to 0.748. So they are more developed now than they were 30 years ago.
Right, and that is the exact assumption you'd make just looking at their isolated growth. Like, hey,
Yeah.
0.748 is higher than 0.683. We're doing great.
But wait, the current global average we just talked about?
What was it?
The global average in 2023 is 0.756.
Yeah.
Wait, so Saint Lucia grew, their number went up, but they're now actually slightly lagging behind the world average?
Yes, exactly.
How does a country start out that far ahead, experience 3 decades of continuous growth, and still end up losing the race?
Because human development on a global scale acts exactly like a treadmill.
A treadmill.
Yeah. If you are on a treadmill and you are jogging at a comfortable, steady pace, you feel like you're moving forward.
Right. You're putting in the work.
But if the person next to you starts sprinting, you are mathematically losing ground relative to them.
Oh, man. That's harsh.
Saint Lucia grew, yes, but the rest of the developing world accelerated at a blistering pace.
And the penalty for just jogging is severe. I mean, I'm looking at their global ranking here. In 1990, Saint Lucia was ranked 56th in the entire world for human development.
Right, 56th is a highly respectable, very competitive global position.
So where are they in the 2023 data?
They have plummeted to 103rd.
Wow. 103rd. That is a staggering drop.
Yeah, falling from 56 to 103 while your actual score goes up, it's a brutal reality check.
It really illustrates the intense competitive pressure of global development, doesn't it?
Absolutely. A high starting point in the 1990s just wasn't enough to guarantee long-term leadership. They hit a period of stagnation.
So we have the baseline. St. Lucia is on a treadmill, they're jogging while the world is sprinting, and their overall ranking is basically in free fall.
Right.
But hidden inside that slightly below average HDI score is the anomaly we teased at the very beginning of the deep dive.
Yes. This is where we need to introduce the Gender Development Index.
The GDI.
The GDI. This is where the United Nations takes that overall human development score and splits it perfectly in half female outcomes versus male outcomes.
Okay, so it separates the data by gender.
Exactly. The index is a ratio. If the men and women are developing at the exact same pace, the GDI score is exactly 1.0.
And just to ground this in reality for a second, no one is actually at 1.0 globally, right?
Oh, far from it. The global average is 0.955.
Okay.
And that number tells a very clear story. On a global aggregate scale, men have higher basic human development outcomes than women.
Which makes sense given the historical context. It reflects the systemic barriers women face worldwide in accessing education, healthcare, and, equitable income.
Precisely. But then you get to Saint Lucia.
Right.
Saint Lucia's GDI is 1.016.
1.016. Let that sink in for a second. It's like discovering a microclimate where the normal rules of physics are just totally inverted.
It really is.
How rare is a number over 1.0?
Extremely rare. It places them in what the UN classifies as Group 1. It's an incredibly small, elite cluster of countries.
Wow.
Yeah, St. Lucia actually ranks 13th globally in this specific metric. It's a place where the female population is mathematically and structurally outperforming the male population across the aggregate index.
Okay, but I am stuck on the mechanics of this.
Sure, what part?
Well, if their overall country ranking is dropping like a stone down to 103rd, how on earth are they producing this elite, globally rare dynamic between their men and women?
That's the real question.
Right. What is the actual engine driving this 1.016?
To find the engine, we have to look at those 3 pillars of the index again: education, health, and income.
Okay, let's break them down.
Historically, when a demographic is marginalized, the first things to suffer are access to schools and access to doctors.
Right, the basics.
But in St. Lucia, the female population has completely weaponized those 2 specific metrics. Let's look at the classrooms first.
Education is the bedrock. You can't build human capital without it. So what does the divergence look like in the St. Lucian school system?
The UN measures this by looking at something called expected years of schooling.
Which means what exactly?
It predicts how many years of formal education a young child entering the system today will eventually complete.
Got it.
The global average for women right now is roughly 13.04 years.
Okay, so the world expects a girl to get about 13 years of schooling. What is the expectation in St. Lucia?
For young women in St. Lucia, it jumps to 13.435 years.
Okay, so they are beating the global average.
They are.
These women are staying in the system. They are likely moving through primary, secondary, and pushing into tertiary or vocational education at highly competitive rates.
Exactly. They are building a massive reservoir of talent.
They are the core intellectual and professional talent pool of the island.
They absolutely are. But a GDI of 1.016 isn't just about women rising.
Because it's a ratio.
Right. It's a ratio, which means we have to look at the denominator. We have to look at the men.
Right. What's the expected schooling for a young man in Saint Lucia?
It's only 12.083 years. 12.08. That is a chasm. You're talking about almost a year and a half of missing education for an entire demographic.
Yeah, it's a massive gap.
Yeah.
And when you look at the adult population, what the UN calls mean years of schooling, which is the actual time spent in the classroom by adults, the gap persists.
What are the numbers there?
The women have 8.864 years of realized completed schooling on average.
And the men?
The men are down at 8.358 years.
Okay, this completely changes the framing of the miracle for me.
Because when I first heard a GDI of 1.016, my immediate reaction was, wow, Saint Lucia is this feminist utopia. They've cracked the code on empowering women.
Right, that's the natural assumption.
But looking at this specific classroom data, this feels less like a story of women soaring to unprecedented new heights and more like a story of men just completely falling out of the system.
And that is the central friction of this entire report.
Yeah.
You cannot separate the female achievement from the male collapse. It is a dual narrative.
The male learning deficit.
Exactly. Yes, the women are securing a powerful advantage in human capital. But the men are suffering from a profound structural learning deficit. And true equality isn't just about one line on a graph crossing another.
Right. If the male line is flatlining or dropping, that creates a structural weakness in the whole society.
Absolutely.
Why, though? I want to understand the mechanism here. We're talking about an island nation of the Caribbean. If young men are bailing out of the education system a year and a half earlier than their female peers, where are they going?
That's the million-dollar question.
Like, what is pulling them out of the classroom?
The UN data flags the deficit, but to understand the why, you really have to look at the economic engine of the region.
Okay.
Like many Caribbean nations, St. Lucia's economy has a massive tourism and hospitality sector, alongside agriculture and construction.
Sure.
These are industries that offer immediate, entry-level, cash-in-hand employment.
Okay, so it's the lure of immediate gratification versus long-term investment.
Precisely. If you are, say, a 16-year-old young man in a lower-income household, the pressure to become a provider is intense.
Yeah, I can imagine.
The cultural expectation of masculinity often revolves around immediate earning power. You can stay in school for another 2 years to earn a diploma that, might get you a better job later.
Or you can drop out today, walk down to the resort or the construction site, and start earning cash immediately.
Exactly. It's a rational economic choice in the short term, but a devastating one in the long term.
Because the 16-year-old girl, who perhaps doesn't face that exact same cultural pressure to immediately perform manual labor, she stays in the classroom.
Right. She gets the diploma, she goes to the local college, she secures the human capital.
And that early divergence sets the stage for entirely different life trajectories, doesn't it?
It fundamentally rewrites their futures. Because leaving the educational system early doesn't just limit your vocabulary or your math skills.
What else does it do?
It fundamentally alters your physical survival.
Wait, what?
Yeah, let's look at the lifespan data next, because this divergence continues dramatically through the course of a lifetime.
Okay, so we have young men dropping out of school to work. You'd think getting a head start on earning a living would give them an advantage in life.
You would think so.
But you're saying this early exit seems to trigger a domino effect that literally shortens their time on Earth. This leads us directly into the longevity gap.
Life expectancy is essentially the ultimate biological receipt for a society's policy choices.
The biological receipt. I like that.
If we look at the global average life expectancy at birth in 2023, it sits at about 73.38 years.
Okay, so roughly 73 and a half years is the global baseline.
Yeah.
How do the women of St. Lucia fare against that?
They exhibit incredible biological and societal resilience. The female life expectancy in St. Lucia is 76.25 years.
Wow. Nearly 3 years above the global average.
Exactly.
And that tracks perfectly with their high education levels.
Yeah.
They have the knowledge to navigate healthcare systems, they likely have better health literacy, and they are living long, robust lives.
Yes, the correlation there is very strong. But then we have to look at the men.
Okay, what is the male life expectancy?
The male life expectancy in St. Lucia is a shocking 69.31 years.
Wait, I need to make sure I heard that correctly. 69.3.
Yes. 69.31 years.
That is a nearly 7-year gap between men and women living on the exact same island.
It's massive.
They are governed by the same prime minister, they drink the same water, they have access to the same hospitals. How is a 7-year biological gap even possible?
It is a staggering divergence. Just for context, women naturally have a slight biological advantage globally. The global male average is around 71 years.
Right.
But St. Lucian men are living significantly below even that overall global male average, while the women are thriving far above the global female average.
If I saw a 7-year life expectancy gap between two different groups without context, I would assume they lived in completely different countries at completely different stages of industrial development.
Yeah, it's that extreme. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, when you see a localized gap this massive, it points to severe vulnerabilities for men regarding health policies, occupational hazards, or societal pressures.
This is the dark side of that early educational dropout rate we just talked about, isn't it?
It is entirely connected.
Let's connect those dots for the listener. How does dropping out of high school at 16 lead to dying 7 years earlier?
Think about the industries pulling those young men out of school.
The construction and manual labor.
Right. Construction, unregulated manual labor, agriculture, informal transport. These are sectors with extremely high occupational hazards.
So they're just physically wearing out faster.
The physical toll on the male body in these industries over decades is immense.
It's literally back-breaking work that wears them down prematurely.
That's a huge part of it. But the other part is deeply rooted in cultural norms around healthcare.
Okay, how so?
Highly educated populations engage in preventative healthcare. They go to the doctor when they feel a lump or when their blood pressure spikes.
Right, they don't wait for an emergency?
Exactly. But populations with lower educational attainment, particularly men who subscribe to rigid ideals of stoicism and toughness, they tend to view doctors as a last resort.
Right, it's the whole I'm fine, I'll walk it off mentality.
Yes, until walking it off turns into a massive, completely preventable coronary event at age 62.
Man. So you combine higher rates of occupational physical trauma with a cultural reluctance to seek preventative care.
And then you throw in potential lifestyle factors, higher rates of stress, substance use, or risky behaviors that often correlate with early school leaving.
And all of that together just shaves 7 years off an entire demographic's life expectancy.
Exactly. It's a compounding tragedy.
So this paints a very vivid, somewhat tragic picture of the 1.016 GDI. The women of Saint Lucia are highly educated, and they are living long, resilient lives. The men are abandoning their education for immediate labor, and they are dying significantly younger.
Yes. The women have won the human capital war decisively.
Which naturally brings us to the ultimate assumption, right?
Right. If you're a demographic that holds all the educational credentials,
And you have 7 more years of active, healthy life.
you should absolutely dominate the economy and the political sphere.
You would hold all the leverage. You have the degrees, you have the longevity. So let's follow the money. Let's look at the economic reality.
Yeah.
Because reading ahead in the data, this is where the entire narrative hits a brick wall.
It really does. We measure this through gross national income, or GNI, per capita.
Yep.
It's an indicator of the standard of living and actual economic power. St. Lucia's overall GNI per capita is solid. It's $20,899.
And that's pretty good globally, right?
Yeah, it's slightly above the global average, which is around $20,327.
Okay, so there is wealth on the island. How is it distributed between these highly educated women and these undereducated men?
Well, the male GNI per capita soars to $25,106.
And the female GNI, the women with the 13.4 years of schooling and the 76-year life expectancy.
Their GNI is just $16,790.
What? That is a massive deficit. We're talking about like an $8,300 gap.
That's an enormous disconnect.
I am completely baffled by this. It's like running a marathon, crushing the competition, and then you cross the finish line and they hand you the bronze medal.
Or, to use an economic analogy, it's like the women have figured out how to count cards and win every single hand of blackjack, but the men still own the casino.
Exactly. The women are winning the game they were told to play. They got the health, they got the education, but the house still holds all the actual wealth.
That is the perfect analogy for a structural glass ceiling. It proves that in St. Lucia, acquiring superior human capital does not automatically translate to equal economic power.
The traditional economic rewards are stubbornly lagging behind the educational achievements.
The labor market is fundamentally segregated.
But explain the mechanics of that to me. If I am a business owner in St. Lucia and I have a pool of highly educated female applicants and a pool of male applicants with, learning deficits, why is the money flowing to the men? Is it just blatant, cartoonish discrimination?
It's more insidious than just blatant bias. It's really about how society values different types of work.
Okay.
We talked about occupational segregation earlier, right? Women, despite their high education, are often culturally channeled into sectors that are historically undervalued in terms of salary.
Like what?
They become the teachers, the nurses, the administrative backbone, the service industry managers.
Critical roles, obviously, but roles that have hard salary caps.
Exactly. Meanwhile, men, even with fewer years of formal schooling, are dominating sectors that reward tenure, physical risk, and traditional old boys networking over pure academic credentials.
Ah, I see.
They're running the construction firms, the logistics networks, the senior management tiers of the hospitality industry. As we said, the men own the casino.
And if they hold the economic power, I'm guessing they hold the political power, too. You can't separate the wallet from the gavel.
You really can't. The patriarchy still holds both.
Let's look at the politics.
The UN data tracks the share of seats in parliament to measure political empowerment.
Right.
Despite their overwhelming advantage in education and health, women hold just 24.138% of the parliamentary seats in Saint Lucia.
Less than a quarter.
And here's the real kicker.
Yeah.
That is actually lower than the global average for female parliamentary representation.
What's the global average?
It sits at 26.544%.
That is the ultimate paradox of this deep dive. You have a country that ranks 13th in the world for gender development, boasting a GDI over 1.0, a supposed beacon of female advancement. And their political representation is below the global average.
This is why you can never just look at the headline number. The GDI over 1.0 is a triumph of human capital. It's a triumph of health and schools. But it has not shattered the structural, systemic barriers of economic and political power.
It's relatively easy for a society to agree that women should be healthy and literate, isn't it?
Yes. It is entirely another battle to get that society to voluntarily hand over 50% of its wealth and its lawmaking authority.
So the health and education battles were decisively won. The economic and political battles haven't even really started.
That's a very fair assessment.
But I'm stuck on something here.
What's that?
If the economic pipeline is this rigged, how did the women secure the education in the first place? To stay in school for 13 years, you need a society that protects your ability to do so.
Yes. And to understand how women are navigating this gap between high education and lower income and power, we have to look at reproductive health and societal safety nets.
Which brings us to another layer of the UN data.
Exactly. The Gender Inequality Index, or the GII.
How is the GII different from the GDI?
While the GDI measures achievements, the GII measures the loss of potential due to inequality. It specifically focuses on reproductive health, empowerment, and the labor market.
Okay, and in this metric, a lower score is better, right? Because we want less inequality.
Correct. And let's see how Saint Lucia stacks up against the rest of the world here.
Give me the numbers.
Their GII score is 0.327.
Which ranks them where?
That ranks them 82nd globally.
Uh-huh.
And it is notably better than the global average, which is 0.455.
Okay, so they are performing remarkably well in terms of reducing this specific type of inequality. What's driving that success? What policies are actually working?
It really comes down to excellent social governance regarding women's physical autonomy and safety. Let's look at two crucial health metrics: the adolescent birth rate and the maternal mortality ratio.
Let's start with the adolescent births.
This is measured as births per 1,000 women ages 15 to 19.
Okay.
The global average is roughly 39.07 births per 1,000.
In Saint Lucia.
They are down to 27.8.
Wow. That is well below the global average. And honestly, it perfectly explains the education data we talked about.
Exactly, because if a 16-year-old girl is forced into early motherhood, her formal education almost always ends abruptly.
Right. The fact that the adolescent birth rate is so low means young women in Saint Lucia have the reproductive autonomy and access to family planning required to actually delay childbirth.
Yes, they are not having their early career and academic formations derailed. And crucially, when they do choose to have children, the healthcare infrastructure protects them.
That's the maternal mortality metric, right?
Right. Globally, maternal mortality is a devastating crisis. The world average is over 216 deaths per 100,000 live births, 216.07 to be exact.
That's heartbreaking.
It is. But in St. Lucia, that number is drastically lower. It's 73.26 deaths per 100,000.
Obviously, the goal is zero. Any maternal death is a profound tragedy.
Hmm.
But comparatively, Saint Lucia has built a medical safety net that is vastly outperforming the global standard.
They really have. So when you ask how the women secured the education, this is the answer.
The state provided the physical safety net.
Exactly. They granted bodily autonomy, they provided family planning, and they made childbirth exponentially safer. That foundational physical security is what empowers a woman to stay in a classroom for 13.4 years.
It's an incredible foundation,
Mhm.
but man, it makes the economic reality we just discussed even more frustrating.
Oh, absolutely.
They have the autonomy, they have the education, they delay childbirth to build their human capital,
Right.
and they still hit an $8,000 wage gap and a 24% political ceiling.
Because again, bodily autonomy doesn't automatically rewrite the tax code or dismantle old boys' networks.
Clearly not.
But there is one final piece of this puzzle that might explain why that wage gap is so incredibly stubborn. We've spent this entire time talking about the average man and the average woman.
Averages are dangerous. They smooth over all the extreme highs and lows.
They absolutely do. What happens when we stop looking at this purely through the lens of gender and start looking at it through the lens of class?
Oh, we need to talk about the gap between the rich and the poor.
Yes, because an elite female lawyer in the capital city is living a very, very different reality than a female agricultural worker in a rural village.
Right, the average doesn't represent either of them. So how does the UN track this?
They use the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index, the IHDI.
EIHDI. Okay.
This is the ultimate reality check. It takes that nice, shiny overall HDI score we discussed at the very beginning, the 0.748, and it aggressively discounts it based on how unequally that health, education, and income are actually distributed across the population.
So if a country was a perfect utopia, where everyone had the exact same wealth and education, the HEI and the IHDI would be identical.
Exactly. But obviously, no place is perfect. Every country takes a penalty here.
What's the standard penalty? Like, how much does the world lose to inequality on average?
The global average penalty, the amount of human development completely erased by inequality, is about 21.9%.
Okay, so the world loses about a fifth of its progress to inequality.
Yeah.
How hard does the inequality penalty hit St. Lucia?
It is like falling off a cliff.
Yeah.
When you apply the inequality adjustment, St. Lucia's score plummets to 0.523.
Whoa.
That represents an overall loss of 30.08%.
30%. Nearly a third of the entire nation's human development progress is just vaporized because it's not being shared evenly.
It is a massive erosion of their development, and the UN breaks down exactly where that loss is coming from.
Let's hear it.
Inequality in income causes a 39.15% loss,
39%.
and inequality in education causes a 37.41% loss.
Okay, this raises an incredibly important question. Let's synthesize what this actually means on the ground.
Yeah, let's break it down.
We talked earlier about that 20,899 average income. If income inequality is causing a nearly 40% loss in the index, it means that $20,000 isn't the reality for most people.
Not even close.
A tiny fraction of the population is hoarding massive wealth, pulling the mathematical average up, while the vast majority are surviving on significantly less.
Exactly. Who is actually benefiting from the growth? The data suggests wealth and quality education are heavily concentrated among a few.
And it completely reframes the educational data, too.
How so?
Well, an education inequality loss of 37% means that quality schooling is also highly concentrated. So while the average woman outpaces the average man, the reality is that the wealthy elite, both men and women, are securing incredible human capital, while the lower income population is being starved of resources.
Yes. The lower income population, regardless of gender, is suffering a massive penalty.
This brings everything full circle. This perfectly explains the male learning deficit we diagnosed an hour ago.
Does it? Walk me through your thinking.
If education is highly unequal and under-resourced for the lower classes, who falls out of that strained system first?
The lower income young men.
Exactly. The ones who face that cultural pressure to abandon a failing school system and immediately enter the low-wage labor market.
It is a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle.
It really is. The wealth is concentrated at the very top. The lower-income boys drop out of school to chase immediate cash. Because they work in grueling manual labor, their life expectancy plummets by 7 years.
Right.
Meanwhile, the women, even the highly educated ones, hit a massive economic glass ceiling because the structural wealth of the nation is locked up by historical patriarchal power networks that refuse to share the pie.
That is the anatomy of the Saint Lucia phenomenon, laid bare.
It perfectly explains how a country can boast a miracle gender development index of 1.016 while simultaneously slipping from 56 to 103rd in global human development rankings.
The internal inequality is literally eating the country's progress from the inside out. Almost a third of it gone.
It's fascinating and, frankly, a little exhausting. Is there any silver lining in the broader data? Like, how are they managing this from an environmental standpoint?
Actually, that is the one area where St. Lucia shows immense structural discipline.
Oh, really? Let's hear some good news.
When you look at the planetary pressures adjusted HDI, the PHDI, they perform exceptionally well.
What does that measure exactly?
It adjusts the human development score based on a country's carbon dioxide emissions and material footprint, basically the environmental cost of their development. The global PHDI is around 0.60.
Okay, and St. Lucia?
In St. Lucia, carbon emissions are maintained at roughly 2 tons per capita.
That's quite low.
It is. They are pursuing all of this development without placing an undue, outsized burden on the global ecosystem. They show a really strong level of ecological sustainability.
So they have ecological sustainability, but immense social fragility.
That's a very accurate summary.
We have covered a truly massive amount of ground today. We started with a single bizarre statistic, a 1.016, and we've unpacked the entire socioeconomic engine of an island nation to understand it. Let's distill this down.
Sure, let's look at the actionable takeaways. The so what of all this data.
Right. If you are a policymaker looking at this UN data, or if you're just a listener trying to understand the actual mechanics of global development, what are the actionable takeaways here?
There are 3 critical, unavoidable interventions that this data demands if St. Lucia or any country facing a similar paradox wants to stop sliding down the global ranking.
Number 1,
Targeted male interventions.
which feels weird to say when talking about gender equality, but the data backs it up.
It absolutely does. You cannot have a healthy society if male life expectancy and schooling are collapsing. Equality isn't achieved by letting men fall out of the system.
So what's the fix?
There must be aggressive, targeted retention programs to keep young men in high school. And we need entirely new public health campaigns designed to break down the cultural stigma against men seeking preventative health care. Support is desperately needed there.
Number 2,
Genuine political and economic empowerment for women.
fixing the glass ceiling.
Exactly. The disconnect between a woman holding 13.4 years of education and only taking home a $16,000 salary requires immediate structural reform.
What does that look like in practice?
It means aggressively dismantling occupational segregation. It means mandating transparent, equal pay for equal work. And it requires intentional mechanisms to break the old boys networks that are keeping women out of that 75% male-dominated parliament.
The human capital has been built. The gates to power simply must be forced open.
Perfectly said.
And number 3,
Massive systemic redistribution.
tackling that 30% loss.
You cannot sustain high human development status when a third of your progress is hoarded by a tiny elite. That 30% inequality loss is the anchor dragging the entire nation backward on the global treadmill.
So, tax reform.
Tax structures and educational resources must be optimized to flow aggressively toward the middle and lower income populations. The inequality loss must be addressed to protect the island's future development ranking.
It is one of the most compelling case studies I've ever seen on why you can never, ever just trust the headline statistic. A number that looks like a utopia on paper can be a V8 engine of inequality in practice.
Data without context is just trivia. You have to look at the mechanisms driving the math.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a lingering thought, something to chew on long after you finish listening.
It's a tough one to grapple with.
We have seen that in Saint Lucia, the government did its job regarding foundational infrastructure. They built the clinics that kept the mothers alive, they provided the schools, and the women of the island did the work. They stayed in those classrooms, they got the degrees, they secured a longer, healthier lifespan.
They absolutely did everything asked of them.
But if superior education, superior health, and superior biological resilience are still not enough to close the gender wage gap or break the political glass ceiling in a country where women literally outscore men in human development, what is the actual missing ingredient?
It's the ultimate question, because it completely shatters the comforting myth that education alone is the great societal equalizer.
Exactly. If education isn't the silver bullet, what is? Does it require aggressive, almost punitive new legislation to force wealth redistribution? Does it require a generational psychological shift in how we value women's work versus men's work? Or is there some invisible, insidious metric of historical power that we haven't even figured out how to measure yet?
Something we haven't even put a number on.
Exactly. Keep questioning the narratives you are handed. And remember that the mechanics of human progress are always, always more complicated than the numbers suggest. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.